FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Welcome. You are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz. Today's May 17th, 2017. Well, epidemic of fake news, you've probably noticed at this point, but what effect is it going to have upon you? What's it doing to society? And what about Trump? Where does he stand in all of this? Well, our good friend Daniel Greenfield is back with us today, and you can find his work over at sultankanish.blogspot.com. And hey, if you got any questions or comments on this interview, any others, email me at kl@kerrylutz.com. Daniel, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me on one more time.
All right, so fake news. How do you define fake news exactly? Maybe that's where we should start.
Well, it's pretty straightforward. Fake news is just stuff that's passed off as news, as events that actually took place that are invented wholly out of whole cloth. So, for example, when we used to talk about media bias means you can selectively report facts. You selectively report a scandal about a Republican, but you don't report a scandal about a Democrat. So, for example, you've got Bradley Manning. He now calls himself Chelsea, decided to be a woman leaving prison. He was pardoned by Obama despite being sentenced to 35 years in jail for turning over a whole lot of materials to WikiLeaks, which the Democrats insist is a Russian front, and that anybody who deals with it is a traitor, but of course there's a different path for Obama. So this is bias. So you're selectively reporting things. Fake news, you're just completely inventing stories out of whole cloth. The Washington Post and CNN have been doing this compulsively now. So they invent things that never happened, and then they pass this off as actual news. They rely on supposed anonymous sources. So, for example, there was the claim that in a phone call with the president of Mexico, President Trump threatened to invade Mexico. Or they claimed that the repeal of Obamacare would actually treat rape as a pre-existing condition. Again, both of these are false claims. They were invented out of whole cloth, and the media is widely reporting them.
All right. And arguably, the New York Times has been engaging in fake news for decades now. If we go back to what they did with the reporting about Soviet Russia in the 30s, which they got a Pulitzer Prize for, it was all lies. None of it was true.
Yes, that was straightforward propaganda, and that was what happened when they basically outsourced reporting to communist sympathizers. But we didn't really have this kind of thing on a constant basis in domestic politics the way we do now. So it was obviously reporting on the Soviet Union, reporting on Israel, reporting on some Islamic countries in general were often really heavily biased and in some cases just fake. But when it came to domestic coverage, you didn't just have the media constantly inventing lies on a regular basis and refusing to retract them. And this is now happening multiple times in a single week.
Yeah, and so what does this do to their credibility? I mean, how many people here, Daniel, really believe what the news media is spewing out these days?
That's the bottom line. So if you look at the polls, most people really don't trust the media. They don't believe the media. And the media is destroying its own credibility. The media really had its greatest strength when it was really operating undercover, when it had this kind of fake balance and the pretense of engaging in journalism. Now it's just constant name-calling. And when you're getting name-calling, then you're eliminating the people who disagree with you right out of hand.
Yeah, so where are they going to wind up? Where is this thing heading, in your opinion?
Well, we're heading toward a kind of cultural clash. There's a major cultural gap at this point. There are people who get their news from CNN and people who get their news from Fox and so on and so forth. There's really no common ground, no point of exchange, and the media is really furious that President Trump's administration has brought in conservative news outlets into press briefings, but this is now the way it is. So the media is losing a great deal of its power and influence, and it's doubling down and becoming even more partisan and more dishonest.
And how is there a future for this type of organization in the U.S.? I'm really concerned about it. Are these entities, the Washington Post, the Times, the ABC, NBC, CBS, do they have a future?
Well, right. The question is, do they have an economic future? So a lot of them are now really owned by corporations. These corporations have their own political agendas, and that's one of the things we have to look at. For example, the Washington Post was somewhat more credible before Jeff Bezos of Amazon bought it up, and now these days it's just really nasty and dishonest. It rolled out its democracy dies in darkness motto. So you have to really look at some of these corporate agendas, and in some cases you have to start holding corporations accountable because they have their own political agendas, and they're using the media to wage them.
Right. So, but you can't, how do you balance it? You can't really send the government in after the media, because then you just open the door for whole-scale abolition or denigration of the First Amendment. Can government do anything about this?
No. First of all, government obviously should not be cracking down on the media. We have a First Amendment. Individually, though, obviously we should be making intelligent decisions about where we buy and what we watch and how we funnel money into some of these corporations, because really what we have with the left is a kind of corporate-backed socialist state, and major corporations have been part of the push for things like amnesty, for things like Obamacare. So it's something we absolutely need to look at. What government can do, however, is look at the ways that the law favors some of these organizations and these corporations and the way that it privileges them, because really they have a lot of unfair advantages. And it's something we should absolutely take a look at. We should take a look at, for example, the way that cable is structured and the way that it pays sizable amounts of money to left-wing outlets that are not actually productive. So it's something we should look at. We could look at monopolies, for example. A lot of the media really is becoming a monopoly. There are a handful of major corporations, and they're in violation of the law. The Obama administration chose to give them a pass. Trump has come into office pledging that he was going to take on some of these monopolies. So it's something that should absolutely be done.
All right. What about the concept of reforming the libel laws to make the media more accountable for lies and false statements that they knowingly perpetrate? Right now, there's a requirement under New York Times versus Sullivan that there be gross negligence, gross disregard of the truth or falsity of a statement that they make. And basically, it almost immunizes them from any statement that they make about a public official, which definition of public official or public person has been greatly watered down over the years, to the point if you sent a letter to the editor, you could be a public person. So what about reforming those laws, and is it possible?
Again, I fall on the skeptical side as far as freedom of speech is concerned. I really think we should have more, not less. Libel is obviously a toxic thing, but if you look at Europe, where they end up using libel laws to really silence political dissent, among other things. And again, it's important to remember that if we have government laws, they're going to be enforced by the same kinds of judges that have been striking down most of President Trump's measures, which means if you say something bad about Obama, you're going to get in trouble. If, on the other hand, you say something bad about Trump, that's perfectly fine. So I wouldn't think that just having this at the government level, giving government that kind of power, would be dangerous and would backfire on us.
Yeah. So this is a question of the public has to evolve and you need to be more discriminating and more of a searcher for the truth than you might be now or otherwise have ever wanted to be.
And you also have to think about just the entanglements with the various businesses, and we have to really think about what kind of society we want. Do we want this kind of system that's run by huge monopolies, by huge corporations that have their own media outlets and that push their own agendas, or do we want to actually democratize and decentralize a lot of it? So really, this is part of what people talk about when they talk about the deep state. It's this huge infrastructure, and that's part of what we're fighting.
Hey, and I think that's a great point, Daniel, that you really need to split up the corporatocracy here, the media empire. It's a cartel, effectively. You got 6 companies that control 90% of the industry, and the founding fathers would never have put up with that. Do you remember growing up, Daniel, you had 3, 4, or 5 newspapers in a particular city? Now, if you have one, you're doing pretty well.
Yeah, it's becoming scary, and the internet is potentially even scarier considering Google's power, the power of Facebook. So after the election, when the media began insisting that Facebook censor stories that they considered fake news, and Facebook and Twitter have been going along with it, Google has begun embedding PolitiFact into everything. So potentially this is even scarier because they really have a chokehold. Most news search traffic goes either through Google or organically through Facebook. So potentially these are areas where the left has decided that it can choke off dissent.
Yeah. So, and again, then we're going to rely upon the government to try to remedy this situation. I mean, is it just enough to hope that the market will impose this discipline on them?
I think this is one of those areas where the government has a legitimate interest in preventing monopolies, because then you really have a state within a state. I mean, the free market is well and good, but it actually has to be free when you have really huge corporations that have monopolies, when you have trusts, when you have organizations that are just immune to public action on an individual level. Then you really need to take some kind of action, because, it's like communism to some degree. You just have this organization that becomes more powerful than a country, and you really can't have that. Google, for example, Facebook have way too much power over people, and obviously in an ideal world, people would make intelligent decisions, and they would avoid that, but really it's becoming inescapable. How do you avoid Google? How do you avoid Facebook? It's becoming really difficult, and it would just be fundamentally unhealthy for us as a country to have one or two corporations in control of everything.
Yeah, for sure. And yet that's where we're heading. The government seems to like concentrated industries, easier to regulate. You only have to deal with a couple of people. You only need one or two checks instead of dozens or hundreds of checks. The government seems to really be a major proponent of concentration of industries.
Oh, yes. And it's perfect, because then you have the big corporations that are lobbying for various measures that squeeze independent operators, contractors, and small businesses out. And then you have this kind of corporate socialist alliance. Of course, in the end, the socialists eat the corporate part of it, but that's perfectly okay. And they create a structure where it's really hard for smaller businesses to compete. And again, we're talking about government action. They write plenty of measures into law. They have lobbyists over the place, and they write measures into law that make it very hard for smaller companies to compete, whether it's licensing, whether it's other areas. So part of what we should be doing, part of what really conservatives who believe in small business should be doing, is trying to break up this kind of power just at the level of removing their privilege legislation and their rent-seeking.
Yeah, exactly. Rent-seeking is really what sums up the whole type of society we have now. It's not capitalism anymore. It's just a bunch of companies seeking to get wealthy at the public trough or through special favors from the government.
Yeah, and they absolutely want to dump the bill for all the things they do, whether it's cheap labor, whether it's healthcare, onto the taxpayers in general. And this is part of how we got Obamacare. It's part of how we got Common Core. They're pushing all sorts of big government measures because, again, they're thinking in big terms. They want national authority. They want national control, and the government wants a handful of these national companies, as you mentioned. And you create this kind of national socialist state that is absolutely un-American.
Yeah, totally un-American and injurious to the majority of the citizenry. It's really not a healthy way for society to be.
It is, and their idea was not to have a country. Their idea was to just have this kind of network of international, transnational systems, and they're all going to be run by international law. Everybody's going to have the same law. Everything's going to be tied together by treaties like the TPP and NAFTA, and they're going to be able to do business everywhere, and countries with national borders will cease to exist.
So Trump is the ultimate threat to this dystopian future that they had envisioned for us, isn't he?
He certainly ran against it, and hopefully he's going to be able to keep his promises, but this really shows the measure of opposition and why he threatens them. Yeah,
that it does. And that's what we need to be really concerned about, isn't it? So, Daniel, you optimistic at all that this isn't going to work?
Well, I think that either way, whatever happens, people are waking up more and more, and they're pushing back more and more. Individual elections don't necessarily change everything, but it's the larger trajectory. Now we're seeing a great deal of polarization, and we're seeing the left come out of the closet. We're also seeing people on the right waking up to what's really at stake, and this is really the next phase in the struggle.
Okay. Well, what about the violence, though? We're seeing the left just become very violent towards any dissenting or contrary opinion. What's the right supposed to do? Do we fight them in the streets, or are we just going to basically watch the whole thing go down?
Well, we have to remember that when we talk about the radical left, this was the real radical left. It comes down to attacks, physical violence, attacks in the streets. But when the left does this, just like the fake news, they're exposing themselves for what they are. So they're going to be contextually different responses, different situations. Obviously, if someone is throwing a punch at your face, you obviously have to fight back. Should we necessarily go out and seek violent confrontations? I don't know that it's necessarily a good idea because, again, when the people who provoke the violence, they end up exposing themselves. So the left's attacks on freedom of speech, their refusal to let speakers speak on campuses, for example, is exposing the left for what they are. And this is damaging to them. It's showing people, even people who are Democrats, who have been moderates, that things are spinning out of control.
Yeah, aren't they, though? Aren't they? So we need this mass awakening, right? We need you to get more aware and understand what's at stake and what's happening here, right? I mean, that's what we really need to carry on the American experiment, if you will.
Very much so. And people have been waking up. They've been slowly waking up. The problem is that the left extremism, the left's power has grown disproportionately to how quickly people have been waking up, and we've lost quite a few battles on various fronts as a result. So the larger question is, will the left destroy its own gains by becoming more and more radicalized? And Trump, whatever else he's done, he has dramatically radicalized the left. He's unleashed its real nature. The mask is coming off, and that's a big deal.
Yeah. So by virtue of the mask coming off, but now he's such a threat to the deep state and the status quo, they're really trying to do a silent coup, aren't they?
It's not even all that silent. I mean, they're openly boasting about a coup. I mean, they've been pushing the whole 25th Amendment thing for a bit, where they insisted that eventually Republicans would remove him. You've got Keith Olbermann on GQ asking the Russians to overthrow Trump. There's nothing silent about it these days.
Are they going to succeed here?
It's a complete fantasy, but this is one of the ways that the left is radicalizing liberals and radicalizing Democrats, because they're getting them to push further and further through the Overton window. They're getting them to embrace ideas that would have been completely unacceptable once upon a time. Obviously, this is bad for democracy, but at the same time, it exposes just how rotten, how dangerous they are. So in a way, some people will wake up, others will become dangerous and crazy.
You know, it's interesting that you say it's a dangerous fantasy, a power-crazed fantasy. Reminds me of the little kid who gets beat up at school and says, one day when I rule the world, when I'm in charge, things are going to be different. And these liberals, they're engaged in this power fantasy. They just can't accept being shut out of the government.
They can't accept it, so they've determined that they're not going to accept it, that they're going to fight it any way they can. So they've unveiled the resistance, and they're engaging in street violence, and they're engaging in basically overt sabotage of a government. There's been no honeymoon period, but not only that, it's just even before they won, they've tried to plant landmines everywhere, and they're inventing these constant stream of fake news stories that are meant to go viral. Things like, for example, rape is a pre-existing condition. They know these are lies. At some point, they will even do a fact check and slip it in and say, okay, this is technically not true, but then they run 20 stories, touting it because they know what people are actually going to pay attention to. So all of this has become one giant, nasty echo chamber by people who are basically sore losers and whose refusal to accept defeat is moving them into increasing forms of extremism verging on civil war.
Yeah, well, civil war, I guess, is the ultimate where things could possibly be heading towards.
Well, in some ways, we do have a civil war, because what happens when the sizable part of the country just refuses to accept the government and says, I mean, they've refused to accept the results of two presidential elections, as I keep saying, Bush and Trump. At this point, let's say some third Republican down the road wins a presidential election, it's pretty certain they're going to refuse to accept those results, and that's really a civil war already.
Really? Who would ever believe that would be possible in the United States of America?
It's a scary thought.
Yeah, well, hopefully cooler heads will prevail. We'll be able to avoid fighting in the streets, or what happened in the Civil War in the United States in 1861, where brother fighting brother. But Daniel, it's a pretty bleak picture. We appreciate your coming on. So the best place to find you still is your blog?
Well, the best place is frontpagemag.com. I'm a showman journalism fellow over there. And while the picture might be a bit bleak, it just reminds us, take the time, spend time with your family, enjoy a sunny day, enjoy a barbecue, remember the sacrifices of our soldiers, and be confident, because at the end of the day, we've had a country for quite a while despite all the odds, and we're going to continue having one way or another. Yeah, agreed. Hopefully that will in fact be the case, and prayers with it. If you have any questions, comments, again, email us, kl@kerrylutz.com. We answer all emails. And take a look at our Twitter feed, @KerryLutz, our Facebook page, Financial Survival Network, where we find the absurdity and the fun in all of the crazy stories coming out. Daniel, it is always great to speak with you. Keep up the great work, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks. It's an honor and a privilege.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.